So I will explain you this, this project, and I hope that you will find it interesting, although this is, most of you are not working in philosophy. This project, as you will see, is not only a philosophical project, I think, although I hope it will have philosophical consequences, but it's not only philosophical. So I will begin reading it. The first thing is to notice the title, which gave me a hard time to translate into English, because in Spanish, I have something that sounds quite good. When you translate it into English, it's not so easy. So now it comes, it says from woman to women, feminine figures in the Aristotelian corpus. In Spanish, maybe you will follow this because it's closer to the French. It goes like from the la mujer en la filosofía aristotélica, so a general theory, to las mujeres en la obra aristotélica. So it's from a general theory to individual or singular characters. Okay, so I'm working still on a nice title in English. That's what I came up with, but maybe may have still some improvement. So, in the 1970s, feminist philosophy and gender studies have done a detailed revision of the authors and works called classics, which you I'm sure are well aware of course, under a critical lens, which of course includes the corpus aristotelicum. Although there are many interpretations, it can be safely said that for the most part, important concepts of the language used to formulate Western philosophy are not neutral when analyzed under this magnifying glass. Within this framework, we understand some radical readings, for example, of an author which you may be well acquainted with, which is Lucy Garay, right? She's a Belgian. That's right, I think. Who, with her peculiar style, denounced, for example, that concepts so basic to Aristotelian physics and metaphysics, such as place, for example, are insufficient to account for a feminine body. When you talk about a pregnant woman, for example, she denounced, well, the concept of body, of place that we find in Aristotle is not enough, just to give an example. But there are many other radical readings, such as Midis, which who's against the neutrality of logic itself, or there are other readings which question the very notions of objectivity or universality or essence. But over the years, feminism that at first raised its voice in a strident way has found modulation, sophistication, and nuances that, without trying to eliminate the previous philosophy, put accents and questions with greater precision. However, Aristotle, as you must know, remains one of the most notable authors when looking for the origin of Western patriarchal thought. And in fact, he has been called the father of Western misogyny. Right? So it's a very big time. So it is not difficult to explain this accusation, or this calling him the father of Western misogyny, when we read, for example, that a woman is considered an imperfect male or a first deformity, although one that occurs according to nature, fortunately, and that is your text number 1. So in comparisons, I'll come back to this text a little bit later, but as weaker, and he calls women a weaker and taller being than her male counterpart. In comparisons between male and female animals, the latter are often described as inferior. Females are said to have smaller brains, have fewer stutters in their skulls, fewer teeth, just to name a few examples. These cases go beyond the anecdotal when they are framed within a powerful metaphysical theory, which is the one that Aristotle has written in the generative domain. The sensitive form, essential for the formation of an embryo, is transmitted by the male, while the female is comparatively passive, and the one who transmits the matter and vegetative soul potentially. If all of the above were not enough, the situation worsens when we find that those negative visions are endorsed in works such as Politics, where the social paradigms of the time are reflected. Women do not have political participation, they are restricted to the domestic sphere, and it is decreed that ideally she must always obey the man for her own good, whether it is the father, the husband, the guardian, whatever tutor they may. In today's presentation, I am not interested in dwelling on the details of these statements. I believe that all of them have already been sufficiently denounced, studied, and fortunately also challenged and contested. On this occasion, I would like to present a different angle on the theme of women in the corpus Aristotelicum. It is a review of the mentions, and if I may use the expression, uses that Aristotle makes of women in a concrete and specific way. Let me explain myself. That the Aristotelian theory in general terms is not equitable between the masculine and the feminine is a fact that cannot be denied. But it is proper to the theories to remain in a very general and in a very abstract scope, which gives them, of course, a possibility of systematization. But I would like not to build in that direction anymore. I have already finished, fortunately, a book on that subject, so now I'm moving on a different direction. And I would like to go from this theoretical and abstract notion of woman in Aristotle, which, of course, might have been approached and thought with prejudices, to concrete individual women who, although scarcely, do appear in the Aristotelian works and have not been studied, perhaps precisely because they are considered marginal and short range. I think that a great achievement of feminism has been to remind us that it is important to look at the specific cases to the individuals, maybe minorities, but, you know, like, putting attention to the individuals. And maybe the readings that we have made of Aristotle from a feminist perspective have just put aside this important way of reading the authors. So I will develop the appearances of the specific women of which Aristotle speaks with their own names, or those very well-defined female groups that perform clear functions that are punctually characterized by Aristotle. So in the general project, not all of it will appear today, but the general project is to explore the female occupations mentioned by Aristotle. So what jobs is he describing? Is he talking about women working, in fact? And he does. The lifestyles that characterize certain groups of women, such as, for example, pregnant women. What does he say about this specific kind of women? Or women who live in different latitudes. For example, he talks about Libyan women compared or opposed to Greek women. What does he say about them? Individual women who are quoted either by their own name or who are anonymously identified as part of some determinate historical events. Turns out we have many of them. Perhaps a study, so female characters also that come from literature or mythology and are references for Aristotle in a specific context. And I'm sorry for some of you studying classics. It would have been very interesting to have these mythological or these feminine characters, but unfortunately, because of time, I didn't focus on them, but just that they are here also in this big project now. So in short, what I want is to show the cases in which women appear as organic parts of society of a whole. Perhaps a study of this nature does not modify the philosopher's theory, but it does complement the vision that Aristotle had of some women. This presentation is just the beginning, as I said, of a larger investigation that intends to extend to the entire corpus. What I will present now comes only from the biological works, including the Parva Naturalia, as well as politics. Before going fully into the references I have found and, well, the ones that I selected for this talk, I would like to explain very briefly why I started with these apparently very different groups of writings, right? The biological ones and the political ones. So in a very recently, quite recently published book by Marguerite Delorier, it is rightly pointed out, in my opinion, that there are two terms used by Aristotle when talking about women and the feminine perspective in general, which most of the feminist critics have used to problematize this issue. And these appear in your texts 1 and 2, so you may want to take a look at them now. So on the one hand, it is said that Aristotle thinks, or it is not said, Aristotle says, the feminine nature and the litita physici is, as it were, a deformity, an apeireia. The other concept that is that of a human being with a deliberative faculty that has no authority or control over itself, which means that it is accurate. The first text, as you can see, comes from the generation of animals, which is a biological work, and the second one from his politics. These two fronts are the hardest, let's say, in terms of gender inequities. For this reason, it has been particularly urgent for me to search in these works for the women observed and referred to by Aristotle, possibly without prejudice. So when you go to theory, you can say, oh, women are inferior, women are deviated, whatever. But when you see what he's talking about, specific concrete women, you see a different angle. So that's what this project is about, and that's why I started with these two groups of works. But the thing is a bit, well, for this presentation, I have something for Professor Destre at the end, but that is a little extra, the poetics and the rhetoric. But well, so we will begin with the jobs. So what women worked on, or what is described by Aristotle. And so this comes, so I would like to make first a reflection on the jobs that are described by Aristotle. So first of all, the biological works in general, but notably in Historia Animalium, provide abundant information on the number of animal species that are typical of different habitats and regions. Although much of the information could and surely was directly observed by Aristotle, the writings also make it clear on multiple occasions that experts of various kinds have been interviewed to complete or contrast their reports. In some cases, the reports are given credence and validity, while in other cases, the opinions of these people are taken with suspicion, reserve, and sometimes outright denied, or their veracity is outright denied. The list of experts, empiri, consulted and referred to is immense and accounts for the great variety and vivacity of the Greek society at the time. We have beekeepers, ornithologists, poultry farmers, hunters, camel keepers, farmers, eel experts, elephant drivers, horse trainers, sponge divers, shepherds, pig keepers. In short, the number reported is enormous, and it is not difficult to suppose, nor perhaps surprising, that all of them are male. In different contexts, and especially discussing Lucy Garay's critics of physics, but it's interesting for me. We have Cynthia Freeland writing about the endoxa and these opinions that were given by the experts from which Aristotle begins with. And I would like you to read those. It's your text 3 and your text 4, in which it is specified that the people, the experts of which Aristotle usually quotes, are always male. In fact, says Deborah Modrak, she says more or less at the end, I will read them at the end. She says the endoxa typically provide Aristotle's starting point in an inquiry, and so his selection of experts affects the outcome. It is not idle then to ask whose opinions will be included among the endoxa. Aristotle subjects the endoxa to critical scrutiny, and this does lead to the outright rejection of some endoxa and the modification of others. Nevertheless, the outcome of his investigation is shaped by his original choices. Which endoxa are included and which are ignored at the outset of an inquiry will have an enormous impact on the outcome of the inquiry. Gender bias becomes all but inescapable because only the opinions of males are included by Aristotle. Well, if it is true that methodologically the examples of women do not usually appear within the qualified opinions, it is also true that there are some works, jobs, traits carried out by women and mentioned by Aristotle in the context of natural works and politics, which allow us to delve a little deeper in the women that Aristotle knew either personally or through external references and with whom he lived or reflected upon, to whom in some cases a significant degree of experience or authority is granted. So first we have a big group, which is that of wet nurses, you know, the women who are feeding babies. It is really interesting the way in which these tithe are described by Aristotle. I was mentioning a moment ago, I think to Anthony, that for that job, the archaeological evidence is super important because we have not so much literature on these women, but we do have the epigraphical writings in which it is described what the importance of the tithe had in different families and so on. I won't get into it because their importance is obvious, but I want to signal that that Aristotle mentions them quite often, and when he does mention these wet nurses, he always does it in a very, let's say, neutral way, always expressing the importance that, for example, what the woman eats will impact in the baby, the importance of the woman taking care of what she's drinking, not to have too much wine, and so on. And he's always talking like, acknowledging the importance of these women. Then we have a second group, which is very important, which are the midwives. Maya, so I don't know if in French it happens the same as in Spanish. The midwife, in Spanish we translate as partera. You know, these women who help women to give birth. I don't know if it happens in French that as in Spanish, because in Spanish it is like somebody who's not so well educated as a doctor. So it is important because she does help to give birth, but she's not considered a doctor. I don't know if that would happen in French or not.
Well, we say sage-femme, but usually she's not a doctor.
She's not a doctor.
But nowadays, of course, she's very important.
Okay. Well, it's interesting for the translation, I think, that the nuance, because one could say, oh, well, when you're talking about this sort of women, it could be somebody who's not very well educated or so on. But the Greek does not have that connotation at all. it is women who are in charge of this, and we have examples of very important midwives. And in fact, the concept comes in Homer, and it evolves little by little. So we have very important examples, like we have Eurycleia, which is Odysseus' nurse. We have Eurynome, that is one of the Oceanids, and the term will evolve. We have we have in the Theaetetus, in Plato's dialogue, an important metaphor with the midwife who helps to give birth, birth to true knowledge and so on. Well, and even in Galen, it will be used for women who practiced medicine. So it is a broad term. Now, Aristotle is explaining how they work and their importance in when a baby is born. And I would like you to read, and maybe we can read this one together. It is your text number 5. So it says, now for the midwife, the cutting of the navel cord is a duty requiring attention to the aim in view. So look, please, there at the Greek, and we have the term dianoias. Dianoias is usually used for not only for being attentive, but also requiring, let's say, some intellectual ability, capacity. So the text is important. For not only must she be able to help. Well, but I kept I wouldn't have translated like this. I kept the original one just for you to show, to see how it is usually translated. But I think it's more than requiring attention. It's like she needs intelligence, some sort of intellectual capacity, not only paying attention. For not only must she be able to help over difficult words with her dexterity, or eucharia, but she must also be quick-witted, in dealing with contingencies, especially over the time of the baby's navel cord, for if the afterbirth has fallen up to, the umbilicus is tied off from the afterbirth with wool, and it is cut off above that point, and if it has been tied off, it grows together and the adjoining part falls off. But if the knot has come undone, the blood runs out and then the embryo dies. But if the afterbirth has not immediately come out too, but remains inside while the baby is outside, it is cut away after the umbilicus has been tied off. Often the baby has seemed to be born dead when it being a weakly child. Before the umbilicus has been tied off, the blood happens to have run out into the umbilicus and the surrounding part. But certain midwives who have acquired this skill have squeezed the blood back inside of the umbilicus, and immediately the baby that had previously become as if bloodless has revived again. So as you can see, this is a passage in which something that we could say like, well, helping giving birth is something very simple, is carefully described. And the importance of the midwives is shown, like they can save mother and baby if they are really skilled or skillful. And if they are not, well, there will be some serious consequences. So I think the description shows that Aristotle is really paying attention to what's going on, to the process, and the importance of these women. So I think this is a nice example of what Aristotle is doing here. Then I have another group of women, which I thought that could be interesting for those studying ancient veterinarian texts. And it has to do with the weavers, the Phenuse, which, there are a lot of mythological and literary references of the women weaving. Yes, you all know a lot of references, but in the biological context, they appear when Aristotle is describing a very complicated phenomenon, which is castration. So animals that are castrated suffer deep changes in their body, in the way they look, in the pitch of their voice. There are many different consequences that a castrated animal has. And Aristotle has absolutely no idea of what is causing that change, because of course they don't have any idea of hormones and this kind of theory. So he tries to explain what's going on in a very physical way. And he does so by describing what happens with the women who are weaving and the machines they use and how they need these rocks and what happens when they remove them. So the example which you have in text 6 is very nice because it shows how Aristotle is paying attention not only to what the women are doing, but the way in which they display their machines. I just put here one text, but in fact it appears repeatedly. So we can see how he's really paying attention to this kind of women. Then we have another group of women, which are the Pharmakides, which you might also have heard or read many times about, with these sorceresses, or we could say witches of the ancient mythology and literature. We have many examples. Well, Aristotle is also describing what they do in a scientific realm when he talks about the hypomanes, or this craziness that some baby horses, the mares have to clean the cattle, the baby horses when they are born, and if they don't do that, there are some sorcerers which go and take this substance from the baby horse, and they use them to make these romantic filters, these love poisons. So it is interesting that Aristotle describes this at least twice in Historia Animalium. I put you here only one example, which is in text number 7. And well, it's now not important to go if these were scientific or more folkloric practices, but still he's describing them, and I found it quite interesting how he describes what these women do and what is the origin of these charms, and they are selling them and so on. It is still interesting that when it comes to women, they are called more Pharmakides and seem to have like a more negative nuance, when men working in herbal stuff are usually called pharmakopole and seem more like in the medical tradition, while women seem to be more like in the charming tradition. But I won't get too much into that, but that's okay, because even Aristotle is always describing if he agrees with the information or not. So this is not, I don't think it is a problem. Then we have another interesting passage which appears in your text 9. And this one comes from the Politics and could be called something like spy women. So we have spies according to Aristotle, and we can read maybe that passage together. So tyrannies, on the other hand, are preserved in two extremely opposite ways. One of these is the traditional way, and the one in which most tyrants administer their office. Most of these ordinary safeguards of tyranny are said to have been instituted by Periander of Corinth, and also many such devices, maybe borrowed from the Persian Empire. These are both the measures mentioned some time back to secure the safety of a tyranny as far as possible, the lopping out of outstanding men and the destruction of the crowd, and also the prohibition of common meal. So it is a long passage in which he's describing what's going on with tyranny and how can you do not to lose control. And then in this context, we have the agreement almost at the end. So he says, and try not to be, the tyrant should try not to be uninformed about any chance utterances or actions of any of the subjects, but to have spies, like the women called, and here the translation is provocatrices, at Syracuse, and the sharp ears that used to be sent out by Europe, wherever there was any gathering or conference. So I looked a bit in this into this sort of women who are spying. So these women are called pedagogides, and the term we have for the action is katascopus. So katascopus comes from a military context and has to do with the reconnaissance of an enemy area. So it has to do a little bit more with intelligence, like knowing what's going to happen next, than to tell about the enemy's strength and so on. And it is interesting that in the LSJ, for example, the pedagogides, which can be found in the entrance of prosagogeion, is rendered as agent provocateur. But then when you go to the example of Aristotle here in the Politics, which is the first one that appears, it is recorded as talebearer. So they are considered as gossip women. But when you see the original meaning, it has more to do with some sort of spying, with really looking what's going on, and so it's not inventing stuff, but really being sort of gathering strategic information. So, well, we can have them in both ways, but in any case, it's interesting that Aristotle is talking about them in this way. Then we have, these are only some examples, right? There are different other ones, and I will hurry up to finish. So we have also, as I had said in your text, well, there are different ones. I will skip them, but we can read them later on with a little bit more of attention of lifestyle. And there is this very interesting institution, which also for historians could be something interesting, which are the superintendent of women and children, the gyneconomos. We have the gyneconomia, which is very interesting because it reveals how women should have been taken care of, according to Aristotle, in different regimes. So he says in democracy, we do not need to take care of women because they anyway have to go out to the market because people are not so rich, so we cannot control them. But in tyrannies, for example, or in aristocratic models, women should remain home. So we will have somebody taking care that that happens. So it is an interesting institution, which is described in some different literature and which appears at least 3 times in the politics. And it's interesting. And then I would like to end with an example, which is very nice, of particular reference. And you have this woman, which is called Pamphile, in your text 13. And there Aristotle is describing the first woman who is said to have produced silk in Greece. So as you know, this is a very antique practice from China, and it came later on to Greece. And this Pamphile, of course, seems to be the first woman in doing such a thing, and he quotes her. And then Pliny takes back his reference, and he says the process of unraveling this and weaving the thread again was first invented in Kos by a woman named Pamphile, daughter of Platis, who has the undeniable distinction of having devised a plan to reduce women's clothing to nakedness. So he has this very soft clothing. And I think it's interesting, everybody, when at least the editions I've read of the Historia Animalium are all very worried about the womb, which is which originated this practice, because it seemed to be introduced to Greece much later. So everybody is very interested about the womb, but nobody cares about the woman who in fact has this merit, at least for the first time. So, well, the last small examples come from the Poetics and the Rhetorics with the same quotation of Cleobulina. So they are said to come from this woman. Aristotle is not quoting her by name directly, but it seems to come this excellent riddle, which Aristotle praises at least twice, seems to come from a woman. So he's not crediting her, but that's not strange, because sometimes Aristotle is not crediting either his masculine authors. So this is not something unique for a woman. But well, it's interesting that he likes that riddle very much and is quoted at least twice. So with this exposition, still limited exclusively to biological works and some examples of the politics, well, this of course cannot itself lead to a definitive conclusion. Rather, it appears as a stimulus to move towards the rest of the Aristotelian corpus. For now, I consider the dimensions of both specific individual women and those who, although anonymous, play a determined and documented role in the various polis should be valued for what they allow us to see from society through Aristotelian eyes. There is no interest, of course, in comparing their citations quantitatively with the much more numerous and well-known citations to men. And I'm not interested here in judging Aristotle at this point. I am interested in knowing what he knew about flesh and blood women of his time and how he describes their lifestyle, as well as about particular groups in certain regions who lived under certain regimes, etc. And if, at least in some of the cases cited here, Aristotle stopped to talk to some women to understand their experiences in childbirth, or if he observed or asked the nurses about the effect of their diet on the babies, because it's not something that he could experience by himself, if he attended a birth and recorded the work of the midwives, we would have, at least in a veiled but still, I think, valuable way, the contribution to women to Aristotelian science. Of course, we cannot replace the first quotations we read of Freeland or Mordach who say that there are no endoxa of women in Aristotle, but still it seems that there is at least important observations of Aristotle from women or feminine activities, which are resembled in his works. And I think that is worth noting that too. So that is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.